Well, good afternoon, everyone, and sorry I'm running a couple minutes late. Those nasty part of my job called voting I had to do. I guess I'm going to start. I know we talked late last week, with a couple of updates and a specific item Senator Kaine and I visited on yesterday. First, in terms of the overall status of the government spending bill, I feel we're living a little bit through the film Groundhog's Day, where we get up every day and we say, we think we're very close to getting this full spending so-called omnibus done, which is critically important for Virginia, particularly for Hampton Roads, particularly for anywhere we've got military installations. A simply continuation of last year's budget would be a disaster, the so-called CR. It feels like things are closer. Chances are we will have to do at least a 1-week extension of government spending. Government spending runs out this Friday, December 16th. We're going to need to get into next week to get this done. I'm still very hopeful that I don't have to spend Christmas or New Year's with my Senate colleagues. I'd rather spend it with my family. But it feels like we are getting to this deal point. Although I should quickly add that it is absolute craziness that we seem to repeat this end of the year scramble virtually every year since I've been here. And this puts obviously federal employees' holidays at risk with even the potential threat of a shutdown. There's not going to be a shutdown, but if you get this close, you have to go through some of the maneuvering and some of the procedures. We waste a lot of time, waste a lot of effort, but fingers crossed we will get it done, and the legislation, which will not only be important in terms of giving continuity till the end of the fiscal year next September 30th, and particularly around defense, but also around infrastructure, around some of the activities around the CHIPS bill. If we're going to be able to build these semiconductor facilities, and I'm still very hopeful for a fabrication facility or parts of the supply chain to be located in Virginia, none of those dollars could be spent out of the CHIPS bill if we don't have a full-on omnibus in place. So very important there. Yesterday, I wanted to talk about a visit that Senator Kaine and I made to MARMAC, which is the Mid-Atlantic Maritime Regional Command, and down in Norfolk. We have been in touch with the Navy. This is regards to the 4 sailors who allegedly committed suicide. I use allegedly because the investigations are still ongoing, but it does appear fairly evident that unfortunately these sailors took their lives. We had 2 sessions. It went on quite a bit longer than we initially anticipated. We met with the chain of command, and there is a surge of additional counseling and mental health resources. There's a surge of other activities reaching out to the families. We then met with a lot of the petty officers. And one of the things that I learned, at this maintenance center where we're preparing ships to get back to sea, you've got a number of sailors there and civilians there who are there on a standard rotation. They know this is their job, and they know when the job will finish. They know when their deployments are over. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of other individuals who are there on, Zach, what's the term again? Yeah, on what's called limited duty. This is obviously a terminology that I was not even familiar with. And these individuals, and I'm not saying this was directly related to these 4 deaths, but many of these limited duty people have come, they may be sailors that are pregnant, they may be sailors that have had mental health issues, they may be sailors that have had medical issues. They're going through some form of transition, and they're placed here so that they, if they have limitations, they may be recovering from an injury, they may not be working, for example, a full 40-hour week. what we saw was that, particularly for some of these sailors who may be in the process of leaving the Navy, but they have to go through a medical review process that can literally take a couple of years. So the idea that you're in this strange duty center without the folks that you may have been deployed with or served with on another ship, in this kind of area where there is no endpoint, raised a real red flag with me. And some of the stories we heard were frankly heartbreaking, from the men and women who were counselors, or again, so many of the folks who were kind of lower in the chain of command, actually supervising the sailors on a daily basis. Again, we're going to let the Navy finish the investigations, but it does raise a bigger question about how these sailors in this limited duty status, how we take care of their unique needs. One of the things that we will get to, I believe, this week is the Defense Authorization Bill. We need to make sure we can then spend what we authorize, and in that Defense Authorization Bill, there's funds for additional subs, there's funding for additional aircraft carrier, there's 14 different military construction projects in the Commonwealth that are really important in terms of quality of life and in terms of actual jobs on those construction sites. But there's also additional support for mental health services. We still have not fully cracked the code on both availability of mental health services within the DoD, and for that matter within the VA, but also then breaking down the stigma that too often exists within the military that makes a young soldier or sailor may be reluctant to use mental health services because they feel like it might hurt their record, might give them grief in terms of some of their fellow service members. But getting rid of that stigma, and this is not a problem obviously just within the military, but it is exacerbated with young men and women who are oftentimes separated from their families, under a high stress job. It's one of the reasons why I also put into the defense bill additional funding for food insecurity and for military housing. Military housing I've been working on for a decade, because it's just not right when these men and women are out protecting our nation, that their spouse or children who may not be deployed has to worry about food on the table, or living in housing where their kids are getting exposed to mold or rodents or other infestations. We've made progress on this, but I will not rest until there's not a military family that is food insecure or doesn't have access to good, adequate housing. And we've got to then, on top of that, make sure that mental health services are both available and that military members use those services. So more to come on this topic going forward. Last comment before we get into the general subject matter. And I'm sure many of you have been following the FBX meltdown, Sam Bankman-Fried, the FTX meltdown. He was arrested last night in the Bahamas. He's not testifying before the House today. Tomorrow we're having a hearing in Senate Banking on this subject. I have been, open to the possible technology innovation that comes around from blockchain technologies, from crypto technologies. But as we've seen, we don't have any regulatory framework. We're looking at losses of at least $32 billion, if not more. Luckily, it looks like there were not that many individual investors. Sometimes you've got some high-risk venture capital funds and others who've they've taken a risk and they've lost. But this whole arena of cryptocurrency, there's a lot of questions. Is there really a benefit there? What is the real purpose? The idea that we have a cryptocurrency so that I could send without any friction and without any currency risk funds to a relative in Bolivia or in Kenya over the weekend. Good case analysis, but the actual utilization of crypto in that kind of process is, I can tell you, is very small. And I can tell you from the Intelligence Committee standpoint, the amount of graft, corruption, swindling, and frankly, illegal use of cryptocurrencies as a payment form for arms payments, drug payments, and even those are not secure. We've been able, the U.S. government, as we've seen with the Colonial Pipeline hackers, we were able to recover some of those crypto funds that they thought were totally secure. So I'm going to be continuing to press on this issue at the Banking Committee tomorrow. And it does raise a bigger issue. I am very comfortable with the security of our banking system, banks, savings and loans, credit unions. I've been a big advocate around community development financial institutions, CDFIs, to get more access to low-income communities with capital. There is, beyond even crypto, there are a whole series of new, what's called fintech tools that are pretty much unregulated. And with all these unregulated areas, when we touch finances, we run the risk of consumers being harmed. And this is an area where I expect to be working with colleagues on a legislative solution in the coming weeks and months. So why don't I end it there? There's a lot of other topics I could get into, but I'll turn it over to Laura and be happy to take your questions.
Senator, our first question will be Jackie DeFusco with WRIC. Jackie? Okay, we're going to move on to Jim Spencer with the Daily Progress.
Senator, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Jim.
Hey, can you address for me, please, what will you think is going to happen if you can't get this omnibus bill done before the House flips? Are we looking at a situation where the House leadership will try to block an omnibus and use it as a sort of a political tool, and then have like continuing resolutions and debt limit fights and everything? Tell me
Jim,
about the importance of getting this all
Jim,
done.
oh my gosh! I mean, I think if we don't get an omnibus, if we don't get this full year spending, what I think will be probably put forward is a full year continuing resolution till next September 30th. That would be a huge problem for Virginia. It would be a huge problem for a lot of the programs, defense, CHIPS, infrastructure. But it would actually still be a better solution than kicking this over to a short-term continuing resolution with a new House that, frankly, a lot of those members want to burn down the House. And they will link the funding of the government to dealing with the so-called debt ceiling, the debt ceiling arguments. For those who don't follow all of this, this is basically saying whether the United States is going to pay for the debts it's already incurred. It is a total political football, and frankly, I think should be eliminated in conjunction with some entitlement reform. So we've got, for example, 50-year solvency around Social Security, for one example. But we've seen this movie in the past. We've seen in the past when an irresponsible House would constantly shut down the government. We went through this under President Trump 2 or 3 years ago, where we went through, I believe it was a 35, 38-day shutdown, where we saw folks, parks shut down. We saw our air traffic controllers stretched to the brink. We saw enormous loss of confidence in the overall stability of the U.S. dollar and government. And unfortunately, as you see Mr. McCarthy in the House try to earn the votes to become Speaker, you see a number of members, including some from around the Commonwealth, threaten to use all these tools to extract extreme positions. And that would be the ultimate disaster if we went into a series of government shutdowns and C.R. brinkmanship. Particularly when we talk about the debt limit, when you put in question the full faith and credit of the United States government, particularly at a moment in time when the rest of the global economy is in such disarray, when you've got China with its own recession and frankly, a mixed up COVID policy, you put the U.S. economy, which even with all our challenges, is still far and away the strongest, and you're dealing with a financial hand grenade that could blow up in all our faces.
Thank you.
Senator, Senator, our next question will be Tony Rahm with the Washington Post.
Hey, Tony.
Hey, Senator, how you doing? Just wanted to follow up a little bit more on your comments about FTX and cryptocurrency. I'd love for you to take stock of the moment. I know you have followed these issues for a long time, but what's the sense you're getting from other Democrats and Republicans in the banking committee and in Congress broadly? Is there like an awakening happening in the wake of what's happened with Sam and FTX?
Well, Tony, I've been trying to keep an open mind. I mean, I'm an advocate of technology advancement. My background was in technology. I think technology has brought us a lot of good things. As you and I have talked for years, I was one of the first to point out the problems with social media companies. A lot of good comes out of social media companies, but there's a deep, dark underbelly of manipulation. I've been one of the first senators to call out, or at least particularly on the Democratic side, problems with TikTok. But on crypto, I've tried to keep an open mind, but I keep looking, show me what is the problem we're solving. Show me where this is actually being used. And some of this, I was reminded this morning, this is not totally new. Some of the distributed ledger technology were actually computer programs that originated in the 1990s. And if it was this, frictionless transaction, and let's talk about Bitcoin for a moment, you can only, if this ever got to scale and you're sending Bitcoin on a regular basis, you could only, the nature of the computer technology right now only allows about 5 to 6 Bitcoin transactions per second. Now, it sounds like a lot, but it is not at anywhere near a scale that could become a useful tool of finance. I mean, the Visa and MasterCard systems process literally thousands and thousands of transactions per second. So in many ways, this has seemed to be a solution looking for a problem to fix. I think in terms of large-scale currency movements in the plumbing of banking, if you can figure out a way to make transactions and clear transactions in a much quicker way, there are still certain check transactions that take days that shouldn't take that long with a float out there. To your specific question, a lot of the zealots, a lot of the strongest advocates, they have been quieted since FTX's collapse. We've seen a number of other platforms collapse. I think you're going to see, and there'll be a line of questioning, and Tony, you may want to tune into tomorrow, where this supposedly independent research firm that was following a lot of these crypto entities that Sam Bankman-Fried was actually quietly funding. There's a lot more questions about a number of other crypto entities that may have had some collaboration with this research entity, I believe it's called Amelia, that is more than problematic. So I think there is a pulling back from members. I'm still, again, don't want to take one, catastrophe, one potential Ponzi scheme and say that's across the board to the whole sector. But I got a lot of questions. I'm sure as heck glad we didn't rush to some loose regulatory structure that would have potentially, allowed crypto a legal way into our financial networks, because once you creep into our financial networks, there becomes an expectation through tools like the FDIC, which backs up our banks, and as we've seen with the Fed in other parts of our financial system when they're under duress, that there has to be some level of insurance behind that, or the Fed comes to the rescue. We are way too early to give any kind of that blessing to the crypto industry. So I am trying to keep that open mind, but my level of questions and the level of self-dealing that has gone on in this sector, I think we're only still seeing the tip of the iceberg.
Senator, our next question will be Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us. Going back to TikTok, It's my understanding that Senator Rubio today announced bipartisan legislation to ban TikTok in the U.S. First of all, I wasn't sure if you were a co-sponsor of that legislation, or if you're not. I know you've worked extensively on this issue, and we've talked about it. What your thoughts are on that latest legislative effort?
Listen, I think Senator Rubio has been a leader on this subject. I have not signed on to his specific legislation, frankly, for two reasons. One, if I were to approach that, I think there is a different approach how you ban or prohibit something that's in literally 150 Americans consumers usage at this point. There are some constitutional and other issues that have to be addressed, so I might have a slightly different approach. The other is that although my patience is running thin, the Justice Department under the Biden administration has been promising for over a year that they have a way to separate, ByteDance, which is the Chinese owner of TikTok, and protect the data and protect the content moderation in a way that preserves Americans. Because there are lots of Americans, I'm not saying everything on TikTok is bad by any means. There are some extraordinary creativity going on TikTok. But they have taken a year plus, they still don't have an answer, which I think is reinforcing my concern that there may not be a technical answer to provide those protections. And if that's their conclusion, the sooner they say that, the better, because what you're seeing, Mitchell, as you know, we've already said the Army, or the armed forces, will not allow military members to have TikTok on their computers. We are seeing increasing number of states who are saying they don't want that their state employees using TikTok. I know there's some conversations even in Virginia about this, whether the governor or the legislature is going to take up this issue. So this may be one where, an attempt to put a firewall the Justice Department has proposed up disappears. And let me be again clear. I have two sets of problems with TikTok. One is the personal data that is being collected about the user, in the case of TikTok, about mostly young Americans, where that's stored, who gets access to it. I firmly believe, and there's been plenty of evidence and exposés that have shown that Chinese engineers get access to that data. And as the Chinese law dictates, a Chinese company has to be loyal first to the Communist Party of China, not to its shareholders or its customers, and that ought to be a giant red flag. But I've almost become more concerned with the fact that TikTok is this giant algorithmic tool. I'm not saying TikTok creates the content, the videos that you see, but I do know they can dial those algorithms. So I can assure you what the product that Chinese citizens see inside the PRC on TikTok, they see videos advancing science, supporting the environment, supporting the Communist Party. What we get in America and the rest of the world is kind of the crack version. And I am deeply concerned as we look about China's authoritarian means, their censorship, their aggressive actions towards Taiwan, that the rest of the world could end up having TikTok, and particularly to young people around the country and around the world, where suddenly they only get images that pop up that say Taiwan's part of China, that promotes Chinese foreign policy, Chinese Communist Party foreign policy, that exacerbates problems in the West, the way, unfortunately, we still see with Facebook and YouTube. So this is one where, again, my patience with Justice Department is running thin. Senator Rubio and I have worked a lot on this. I would take probably a different legislative approach, but if we don't get a solution out of the Justice Department, some type of legislative approach may very well be necessary.
Senator, our next question will be Kelsey Childress with WSUT.
Hey, Senator, thanks for doing this. Going back to the spending bill, I know you touched on it a little, but why are Democrats pushing so hard to pass that year-long spending bill instead of just waiting until the new House and new Congress comes in?
Because it would be crazy, and it's not just the Democrats. Many of my Senate Republicans, and frankly, a lot of the House Republicans realize when you turn the keys over to a group of people and I'm not by any means saying this is the majority of House Republicans, I'm talking about that fringe group that have said they will shut down the government if they don't get what they want, that they will put the full faith and credit of the United States at risk with playing political games with the debt ceiling. It would be totally irresponsible to do that when we could actually give our Defense Department, our military installations, our federal employees, the folks who want broadband, the folks who want the infrastructure, the certainty that the federal government is going to operate in a predictable way until the end of September. I've not heard any rational person tell me why kicking the can on this issue. I know there's a debate between defense spending and non-defense spending. We have this debate every year. I think it's down to a relatively small amount at this point, and it's in the tens of billions. While that is a large number, even Washington-wise, there are ways to bridge the gap. But I have not heard one responsible commentator, including most of my Republican friends, say it would be a good idea to kick the can and to limp along from one continuing resolution and one government shutdown to another. If you hear from somebody who's got a good case on that, I'm open to hear. But there is not a financial, I can assure you, even from the most conservative financial prognosticators, nobody wants to see government shutdown after government shutdown.
Senator, our next question will be Tom Fitzgerald with WTTG.
Senator, good to talk to you.
Hey,
as you know, there's a major event at the White House today for the Respect of Marriage Act being signed into law. You voted in favor of it. This is going to safeguard marriages in respect of protecting it against any possible Supreme Court action to undo same-sex marriages. It also is going to protect Loving versus Virginia. And I wanted to know from your viewpoint, you can explain to people the importance of this, because this seems like a massive historical moment here that doesn't really seem to be getting its due right now.
Amen, Tom. Amen. And you know, and this is again a case where, you know, frankly, the American people are so far ahead of some of my colleagues. You know, it was a couple years back that the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage, and for that matter, interracial marriage, was legal. But as we saw with the Dobbs decision, where we thought that Roe v. Wade and a woman's health care choices were legal, the Supreme Court overturned that. So if you simply rely upon the court, and you've had justices on the Supreme Court, you know, say maybe some of these other rights need to be re-examined. The legislation that the president will sign today, I wish we'd go further, but what it says is that a marriage that's legal in one state, another state has to recognize that marriage. So that means even if the Supreme Court overturned the decision that protected same-sex marriages, it wouldn't mean that a marriage, for example, a same-sex marriage in Virginia, would be protected candidly. But it would mean that couple could go to Maryland and get married, and their marriage, Virginia would have to recognize that marriage. So I wish it would have been a full legalization of same-sex marriage. And let me be clear, Tom, the law, for those folks who are concerned about religious liberty, you know, there is complete carve-outs. No religious institution has to marry anyone that falls outside the tenets of their faith. And there were a number of major Christian and other denominations that supported this bill. But it still is simply saying you have to respect a marriage that's legal in another state. And right now, because we still have an overhang in Virginia from a constitutional amendment that I opposed back, I think it was 2007, we have a constitutional amendment prohibiting same-sex marriage in Virginia. So even when this president signs this bill, if the Supreme Court overturned the decision that protected same-sex marriage, those marriages that took place in Virginia, same-sex, would be literally then under Virginia law illegal. You'd have to go get remarried in, you know, about half the states that have now protected same-sex marriage, and then Virginia would have to recognize that. And Tom, you made the comment about Loving versus Virginia. For many viewers, they may not remember that it was the state of Virginia that up until the 60s still prohibited interracial marriage. And Loving v. Virginia was the Supreme Court decision that said two Americans could marry each other even if they were of different races. And one of the things that I never thought I'd have to answer, and I remember it was in Charlottesville a couple months ago, where a interracial couple, black and white couple, who'd been married 30 plus years, had a number of kids, were saying, Senator, in terms of this was right after the Dobbs decision, and there was question, could the Supreme Court undo our marriage? What do I tell my kids? And since Virginia was very late and Virginia was the home of massive resistance, and we only recently are still in the process of dealing with racial reconciliation in Virginia. This ought to strike doubly home in Virginia. So this law is terribly important. We still have work to do at least the Virginia level to make sure that all of these marriages that have taken place, particularly on same-sex basis, since spacing off the name of the Supreme Court, since the Supreme Court decision, that those will stay legal and that folks would not have to go do another marriage in another state if the Supreme Court decision were overturned.
Senator, unfortunately, we are out of time.
All right, thanks everybody. We'll do it again soon. Thank you.